All right, John. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, but 7 p.m. here, so it's about time to start. Well, to start off, I really want to say thank you to everybody that's joining us today. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today to learn and to talk a little bit about farm budgets and about profits as well. That's the main goal. Just as housekeeping, I wanted to let you know that if you're looking for RUP or CCA credits, make sure to stay until the end of the presentation. So we're going to give you a link and you're going to fill out the survey and be able to go to get your CCA or your RUP credits. As you can see on the bottom of your screen, you're going to see like a place where you can, it's called Q&A. So if you have questions, please make sure to put your question there that John will be answering those afterward. Also, John want to make that a little bit more interactive. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, make sure to put there so we all can learn together. We know that sometimes financing is not the best topic ever, so we want to make that as easy as possible. To start off, I wanted to introduce my good friend, John Laporte. John Laporte, he's a farm bills manager, and he's based in Cass County, and he worked with a lot related to farm business, such as income tax, education, business plan at transition. And prior to joining us at MSCU, John used to work for USDA as a farm loan officer. And also after that, he was working as a CCA, a certified crop advisor for a local co-op. With that, John, thank you so much for taking the time and doing that for us. The floor is yours, and we are here for you, man.
All right, thanks, Ricardo. Make sure that got all the technology working. So today, as we get started, I'm going to be the main speaker, but Ricardo's going to kind of help keep me on target as we go along. So you may hear him jump in and ask a question here or there, or kind of point something out if I kind of forget to go through it. So he's my able-bodied assistant as we kind of go through this today. So first off, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Tonight's webinar, Farm Budgets. We want to talk about planning now for the profits that you want to have as a farm business. And so as we've kind of talked, or as we kind of advertised kind of going into this, there's a couple different things we kind of want to make sure we kind of have come across for folks tonight, kind of our main objectives. We want to spend some time talking about how to actually find the cost of production for your farm and how that relates to your farm budgeting and looking at your overall planning. We want to spend a little bit of time on farm records, talking about the difference between records for your taxes versus records for the production year. We also want to spend a little bit of time looking at industry benchmarks and how those can be very useful to improve your farm. And we also want to kind of highlight some decision-making tools that we have available through MSU Extension. But first and foremost, and although it's the last bulletin on the list here, it's actually probably the most important that we want to highlight tonight is why paying attention to details is a must in this business. And so again, tonight we're talking about farm budgets. And so let's kind of think a little bit about, or at least discuss, what really are farm budgets as a kind of a starting point for our talk. So pretty straightforward. Farm budgets, they're really the plan for the year. You're looking at the production and the financial success for the operation. But the other thing that comes to mind when we start to think about production and financial success is that budget really becomes a reflection of the farm's capabilities. It's showcasing its strengths, but it's also being very honest about the weaknesses that exist within the operation. And kind of has an idea of what really is the situation for the farm, what is its ability to be successful from a production and from a profitability standpoint. But to build a really good farm budget, you need to have a foundation to make sure that it's reasonable and that it's accurate to what's really going on the farm. And your historical cost of production is that foundation. That's why when we talk about farm budgets, we instantly go to cost of production, because we need to know what has the farm been able to do in the past, so we can start to think about the future. Or another way I like to think of it is, you can't really see where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And so that's why we want to spend some time today talking about cost of production and really how to find it for the farm. So if we want to find cost of production, we first probably need to spend some time talking about what is cost of production and what is it not. And so we want to do a little bit of a comparison here for folks. First, let's talk about what is it not. It is not just your input costs. As farm producers, we get really caught up every year thinking about seed and fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, all those things that we've got to buy. We're kind of making sure we're looking at how much we've got to buy, because we need fertilizer. We're going to need to get the seed. We've got to make sure we got the chemicals we're going to be able to spray. So we get really focused on those things that we're going to buy. And these variable costs, the price for these things change year to year. And so we're constantly worried about, well, what is the price today? What was the price yesterday? Is it going up? We know that's a concern this year with fertilizer. Prices are going up. We want to lock in good prices. So we kind of get really focused on these variable input costs. Well, cost of production doesn't just focus on those things. It focuses beyond the variable expenses, and it also talks more about the fixed items you've got to pay for, these fixed costs, things that maybe we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. We spend some time, but it doesn't quite get the attention that maybe seed and fertilizer does. But your farm insurance, land rent, labor costs. Typically, labor is, for the most part, if you've got hired employees, that's typically a pretty stable cost for the most part. You'll see some fluctuations some years, but these things kind of tend to be pretty steady year in, year out. And so we don't think about them as much because we don't have that variability, but they're part of that cost of production. They're part of your ability to raise a crop, or if you're raising livestock, to raise a commodity, whether it's beef or dairy. They're part of that overall picture. The same is true for depreciation. And we're not talking about the depreciation you're going to find on your tax return. This is more about the wear and tear, the value of your assets as they age from one year to the next. We know that equipment and buildings over time, they lose value. You can continue to give them good maintenance and repair, but they're still going to ultimately be worth less money in the end. And we have to think about when we're going to replace them. Well, that loss in value over time impacts the overall value of the business. And so if we want to maintain the value of the business, we have to offset it somehow. And the money that we generate through our revenue and the money that we keep after we've paid for our cost of production really kind of offsets that and tries to maintain that value of the overall business. So cost of production takes into account that lost value over time on depreciation. So as we think about cost of production, another thing that it is not is based solely on your IRS tax returns. Now, if we think about tax returns, we've got a number of activities going on here. We've really got income and expense from multiple years. In some cases, it might be 2 years, but in a lot of cases, we're talking about 3 years. We've got inventory sales that we carry over. You put anything in the bin that you're going to carry over into next year. Well, that was last year's production, even though you're selling it this year. And that's really not part of this year's production year, but it is part of your tax return. It's part of those cash transactions. Now, if you're also talking about the production of sales for this year, you've got some of that. If you sell any of this year's crop or any of this year's livestock, and you've got any costs that you incurred this year towards the production year, those are going to be in the tax return, of course. But then you've also got maybe some prepaid expenses that you buy For next year, you either do that for tax purposes or because it's a good time to buy those inputs because the price is right, or a combination of both. And so your tax returns really got a mixture of different years. It's not really a good gauge of where your cost of production is. That's because cost of production is really based on the production year itself. We want to look at only the actual production sales and costs that were part of the year. And we want to look at any prepaid expenses that maybe we had brought in from the year before that we actually used this year. And then we also want to account for any inventory we're going to carry over into next year and what that value is to get an overall picture of what the production cycle was for this year on the farm. And so we start to talk about that. Well, how do we get to a production year? And this is a case where we're going to kind of go away from the PowerPoint and we're going to go to an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm going to kind of walk you through how we make that change and take that information from your tax return and use those cash transactions to get to this production year. And so if we're still on my screen here and we're on the Excel spreadsheet, we're looking at basically we start out here on this spreadsheet, and the first thing I want to draw everyone's attention to is this column D here, where we talk about sales in the year for 2020. This is essentially, we're talking about first starting with your tax return or the same type of information that you would see on your income statement. And so we've got all this activity. So this is what we report to the IRS as our cash transactions. But I mentioned before that we're talking about inventories and prepaid items. And that's where we spend all this time, or you maybe hear out there, especially from your lender, that you need to have an end of year balance sheet. Well, this is where you make use of that end of year balance sheet because you're tracking those prepaid items on that balance sheet. You're tracking inventories on that document too. So in this case, we're going to look at an example where we're going to use those balance sheets and the income statements to talk about how we find the seed cost for this particular example farm. And so we're going to look at corn, soybeans, and wheat here. And again, we're going to start with our tax return information. We're going to look back over here to the balance sheet that we had to start the year. We ended on the 2019 year. And we noticed that we prepaid quite a bit for oh, excuse me, I'm on my income. I need to be on expenses. Sorry about that, folks. Let me start back here. Well, actually, let's stick with the income. We can still do this backwards, Ricardo, from what we talked about. So we're looking at income. So we've got inventory here, and we want to think about from the inventory. So these were our sales, and we had inventory of valued of about 88,000 for corn and 180,000 for soybeans. So this was the inventory we carried over from the year before. It was actually sold. It's actually in this column here from our tax return because we might have carried it over, but we sold it actually in 2020. And when we've got these sales, so in this case, we don't really want to include it as part of the sales. We actually want to subtract it out of this value here. But at the same time, we had inventory that we were going to carry over into 2021. And so we're going to want to make sure we add that to our cash transactions. And so we've got a subtraction of the inventory we carried over. We've got the transactions we actually had during the year, and then the inventory we're going to carry forward. And when you do the math, we come up with this actual total income for the 2020 year. And so when you look at this, you can use that information. And if we've got over here, we've got some examples of this example farm. We've got some corn acres, soybean and wheat acres. We're looking at a case of where we can actually figure out, because we've got the total income for corn, we can divide that by our 300 acres and find out our gross income per acre. And we can also then say, well, we know what our production was. at the end, after we've gone through the year, that we can figure out essentially what our price was per bushel that we received for the year. So we have some actual income dollars here. And so as we're thinking about this, we're looking at where we've got an idea of what the actual income was for the farm.
John,
Yeah.
may I just ask a question pretty quick, so make sure that we are on the same page? We are
Yes.
talking about actual income for 2020, right? And to get to that number that's in that dark light green over there, we are getting all the sales that we had in 2020, plus the inventory also in 2020 by the end of the year, minus the inventory from at the end of 2019. Is that correct?
That's
Okay.
correct. Yep. So you're looking at this from we're starting out with what we put on our tax return. We're adding the inventory that we valued at the end of the year that we're going to carry into 21 in this example. But we also know that the inventory we carried over from 19 is mixed into these sales. Comes up often is, okay, I've got this actual information. What am I going to do in terms of planning? How does this help me in terms of my planning situation? And so let's talk about when we plan. When we plan to go into the next year, where this becomes important is, so this kind of is, I think, going to be pretty straightforward for most people, maybe a little familiar, that when you're figuring out your plan, you've got kind of an idea of an expected bushel or price per bushel. You've got an idea roughly what your production history's been, what you think the yields are going to be. And so you kind of have this estimated gross income. And so this kind of gives you an idea that you can kind of compare this back to your history and say, well, okay, this is what I'm projecting. This is what I think is going to be the new value. How does this compare to what my actual history's been in terms of the financial success of the farm? So let's look here back to our actual, and we see here on corn, we'll look at corn and say, well, last year we got $733, almost $34 per acre. We're projecting a little bit higher than that at $765. Well, the key difference is we have to look at maybe what is different this year. We've got 170 bushels that we've outlined. We're looking at, well, we had about 170 bushels last year, so we're using fairly similar yields, but the difference is really comes down to this price. And that may be fine because we've got a situation like last year where we started out the year with a lot lower prices. And suddenly at the end of the year, we get this big bump up in price for corn and soybeans. And so maybe we contracted earlier in the year and didn't quite get all that bushels were sold at the higher price. So we're looking at the fact that we've got, not as quite as high a price as what we're expecting to be able to go into the next year. Now, the question is, did you contract everything at $4.50, or is that kind of an optimistic viewpoint of where we think the price is going to be? And so the question you have to ask yourself is, if I had $4.30 last year and I'm expecting $4.50, do I really expect I'm going to get that for all of my bushels? And so maybe the question is, and this is your decision as a farm manager, is do maybe I use a lower price similar to what I had last year, or at least a little bit lower than maybe what the top of the market is, understanding I didn't get everything contracted. Now you could have a reverse of that, where maybe you look at this projection and you say, that yield was a little bit lower, and so than what was normal for the farm. So we want to kind of boost this up a little bit, just a tad bit lower than what our average has been. Well, now we look at that and say, well, we've now bumped up our gross income with this higher yield and higher price. Do we feel comfortable that that's more representative than what we've done in the past year? And the really nice thing about this is if you do this year in, year out, what you have is a good long history to look back at and say, does this projection on our corn kind of fall in line with what we've historically been able to do over time? Because we know that market prices go up and down, our yields go up and down as we have, weather situations. What actually happened in the farm's history? Does that kind of match up to what we're looking at in our plan?
John, just like to make sure that we are on the same page here, and I have a question.
Yeah.
Does always pay to be conservative when it comes to prices? Is always better to go conservative, or you think that sometimes, oh no, don't worry, go big or go home with those prices and ideas that's going to happen next year?
There is nothing wrong with being optimistic about prices and about yields, as long as you kind of temper it with understanding what the farm's actual history shows you it's been able to do. And so I would say you kind of want to be somewhere in the middle. You don't want to be so conservative that you think it's going to be, especially if the last year was a really bad year. You don't really want to plan that this next year is going to be exactly the same. We had 2019 was a really good example of that. And we had a really tough year in 2019. Folks are trying to figure out, how do I plan for 2020? And you almost kind of want to forget about 2019 because it was such an oddball year.
Right.
And so when you're looking at your plan, it's okay to be optimistic, but just kind of make sure when you're looking at the numbers, and if you're looking at your actuals, and this is where multiple years of doing this actually helps. Yeah. You can kind of say, okay, we've got some really good prices. Have I historically been able to get the high price? Maybe I want to project something a little bit lower than the high, but I'm expecting this year is going to be a lot better. And that's exactly what we did in 2020. We went back, I worked with a number of folks where we went back and looked historically, well, what has the farm been able to do on years outside of 2019? And let's kind of plan around those years and not focus everything conservatively about what just happened. And so I think you kind of want to be somewhere in the middle, but don't lose the optimism, because we want to be able to take advantage of these higher prices and the potential for really good yields. Just make sure it's kind of within the realm of possibility for what the farm can achieve.
Thank you.
And so looking at the income, let's go back to the expense side of it. We originally were going to start with an expense example. Let's kind of go back to that now and kind of highlight kind of the same thought pattern. And we want to look at corn seed, soybean seed, and wheat. We're going to the same exact farm example. Again, we're going to look at the starting at the income statement, our tax return information, these cash transactions. And the exact opposite, though, is going to happen here from what we saw from income. Whereas we were looking at that balance sheet from 2019 and saying, well, we got to take out the inventory because that wasn't part of the year. Well, when it comes to prepaid expenses, it's the exact opposite. You prepaid in 2019 for something you're going to use in 2020. So we did the same thing in 2020. If we prepaid for anything, it's going to be used in 2021. And so we actually want to add these to our cash transactions that we've got listed. But when we come to the end of year balance sheet, now we want to subtract the prepaid stuff we're going to use in 2021, because we're not going to use that for 2020. And so we again work our way as this plus, we're adding these and then subtracting out those prepaids to come to our actual total expense for 2020. And when we divide our seed expense by our acres, we can kind of figure out where our cost per acre was for seed, what our actual cost was when it comes to that. Now, one of the things that the question becomes, we want to think about how we're going to use that in our planning. And so let's bring back the example of the plan for the coming year and say, let's look at some comparisons of when we think about how we're going to account for seed cost. We know what the price per bag is going to be. And if you're talking about corn or soybeans, we know the seeds per bag. Typically, it's printed on the bag. It's usually for corn 80,000 seeds per bag, 140,000 for soybeans. There may be some variation, so you kind of take note of that. And you know what you're planning to actually plant on the farm. And so you use this information to calculate what your cost per acre is going to be. Essentially, you think about how many acres can a bag plant, and you're using your planting population to kind of divide out that seed per acre, and then you're multiplying that back to your seed cost for the actual bag itself. And so we look at corn and soybeans. That's pretty straightforward. Now wheat's a little different because we've got usually a 50-pound bag, and we're concerned more about seeds per pound, and our planting rate's a lot higher, so there's a little bit more math involved. But we still get to the same place where we're accounting for, based on the cost of the bag and our planting population, what our cost per acre is going to look like, what we think it's going to be. Well, now let's go back to our actual expense from the year before, and we can do some comparisons. So we talked about wheat seed, and so we're looking at about $37 per acre. We come back down to our plan here, and we're roughly pretty close to about the same cost. Soybeans, we're looking at the same thing, about $46 we had last year. We're seeing a little bit of a variation from that. The big difference is actually in corn. Last year we had $133 per acre. This year we're only looking at 112. Well, why might that be? And kind of going back to Ricardo asked before about being conservative or highly optimistic, and thinking about what maybe happened the last year and what historically the farm's been at. Was last year a year where maybe we had a lot of extra plantings? We had to replant a couple of times, so maybe this is reminiscent of 2019 where we had some situations there. Or maybe it's another problem where we actually had a decent year, but maybe we found we had some planter issues, that maybe we were putting down a little bit more seed than what we thought, and we've got to go back and look at maybe what some of the problems were with the planter. In other cases, you might see where the reverse is true, where maybe your seed cost is going to be a little higher than what you had last year. And why might that be? Well, it could be because maybe you're using more genetics than what you were before. You're trying a different type of seed than what you've planted. You're trying to address some things on the farm. Or maybe this situation here is because maybe you're going in the opposite direction. Maybe you're looking at a non-GMO contract, and so you've changed the type of seed. And so what you want to kind of keep in mind, and why the plan is important compared to your actual, is, does it reflect what the farm's capacity has been? Does it reflect maybe a change in the operation that's going on? And where this becomes really important is you think about making decisions as a farm manager, and as somebody that was a loan officer at one point. When you're talking to a loan officer about why something is different from your history, these are the things you talk about: is what kind of changes did you make on the farm, and what are you looking to do? What things did you learn from the year before? And so in the case of the example where maybe this was a planter issue, you look back and compare to your actual, maybe you didn't really realize that maybe there was a planter issue, but you spent a lot more on seed. You knew you had to go back and buy more bags than maybe you thought you were planning to begin with. And so this kind of tips you off that maybe you need to go look at that planter a little bit, or maybe there was some other issue out there that you had to go out and look at. But the idea is to kind of take that actual, compare to your plan, and say, am I within reason of the farm, or am I seeing drastic differences, and what's driving those numbers?
And John, it appears to be like you're so focused in detail, but does detail matter, man? All right. I mean, so see the difference between cost per acre for corn seed over almost $20 or so. I mean, it is a big lump, right? So I think that helped me to go back and say, hey, what I did last year or I'm doing now that's different, right? So it matters. I mean, you might say, well, only $20. Well, but $20 times 500 acres, right?
Right.
So is that where you will help you will be your make or break, right? And John, one question I have, we're talking about corn, soybean, and wheat. Can I apply that to other crops? Let's say we have folks here that are working with vegetable, with other crops. Okay, so can I use the same idea and translate that to their farm use as well?
Absolutely, because when you're talking about other crops, and this applies to crops, it applies to livestock operations. If you're talking about fertilizer, chemicals, you do the same thing with those inputs. Your feed costs, the feed that you purchase, if you've got any livestock, keeping track of what you've purchased. And keeping track of your inventories of what you've got for any feed that you've produced, you want to be able to kind of understand what those are for those operations, because there's still a cost even if you produce your own feed. You want to keep track of what you've got in those inventories, and think about what was used in that production year, especially if you're not tracking feed through a feed system. Now we have a lot of producers that do, but it helps to understand what am I actually putting into that animal. Now, you also asked about vegetable and maybe even fruit producers, some other crops that are out there. These concepts apply to every single input you have on the farm. Now, it's a little harder to track some of these things. For example, fuel and repairs, and some of those items are a little bit hard to track. How much did it go to the corn? How much went to my summer squash? Those type of things. And so the items you want to focus on are the ones you can track when you get that feed bill coming in. You kind or that fertilizer bill coming in. You want to kind of make note of where that went to. And that kind of brings me to the next point, that where we talk about farm records. Because how do you get to this point? How do you actually get yourself to a point where you can do this analysis, where you can break all this stuff down and get to these actual costs beyond what you've got right now from your tax return? And that's where we talk about where farm records must have details. When we think about expenses, your seed can't just be seed. You need to actually, when you're putting that in your farm record of what that expense was, you need to make sure you're accounting for what was the seed cost, what was the soybean cost, or the wheat cost. The same thing applies to fertilizer. When you get that fertilizer bill in, it may not be very apparent when you're looking at it that how much of this went to corn or how much went to soybeans. But even taking a quick time to put some notes on that to say the potash went to soybeans, or so much of the potash went to soybeans, and just having a rough idea of what the actual cost should be broken down to is a big step in terms of trying to get to the information you need to do this. The same is true of people that have feed for livestock. If you're looking at feed that you want and what you want to track on the farm, if you're talking about you want to track your cows versus your calves versus the heifers, it's taking the time to put the notes on those things and make sure going into those records you're separating that stuff out, so you can come back later on and look at what was the actual cost for the different production areas of the farm. What was our actual corn cost or soybean cost, and so on.
John, I do have two questions that I think make sense to ask those right now because folks are asking, and I know we are making a conversation, but I think it's important. So the first question was very good from Erica. She said, what's the cost, what's the actual formula for cost per acre with the amounts that you noted? Cost of bag, seed bag, planting. So I think she was asking about the formula. Do you have the formula that she can use, or maybe you can even email to them tomorrow morning? Would you think that's an option?
Yep. Let's go back and look at that, because that's actually a good question. That we wanted to make sure we actually did cover that. So I appreciate that question. That comes back up. What we're looking at here, and I'll kind of use this to just briefly kind of walk through what I did real simply is I'm taking, and it's a little hard to see when I put the formula up. but I take the cost per bag and I divide it by the seeds per bag. So I know what my cost per seed is. And then I multiply it by the planting population. And so if you know what the seed cost is, the cost per seed, and you know what your planting population is, you can do that for corn and soybeans very easily. Now the math's a little bit harder to do with the wheat because there's an extra variable, but it kind of starts out the same way where we're trying to kind of get to the same thing about what the seed cost is. And so what we're looking at is we're actually trying to find out how many seeds we have in that bag. And so you start out by actually multiplying the pounds per bag and the seeds per pound to kind of get you back to this same level where you're at with corn and soybeans. And then you divide by your cost per bag and then multiply by your planting rate again. And so that's a very good distinction because you're kind of thinking about things in reverse when you're doing the planned versus the actual, because we start out with we know what the total expense is, and we know what our acres are going to be because we know that's what we planted, and so we can break that down to a cost per acre. When you're going the reverse from the cost per bag, you've got to get it to what you're planning to actually put on that actual field. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, and John, and just make sure, like I think that's what you're all saying, like that 80,000, 140,000 is like the number that we know is a known number that is gonna come in a bag, in a bag of corn or in a bag of soybeans. Am I correct?
And you want to check the bag though, because there are cases where we'll see a soybean bag where maybe
A
it's
little bit different.
yeah, like 130,000 versus
Yeah,
140, depending where you're buying it from.
right. And
Go ahead, Ricardo.
yeah, and the other question is right here. I think they're a very good one as well from Ray. He was, how do we document hay? It's 1 year and it's used partially used that year and partially the next year. So how we do that?
Well, for starters, you want to have where we kind of get to this idea of income, and that's a very good segue. When you're thinking about your production and valuing your inventory, or valuing eventually your sales, it can't just be sales. It can't just be inventory. You need to think about what it is you've actually produced. And when we think about sales, we want to know what the units were you actually sold, because we want to be able to kind of compare back to, well, we think we have this much in storage going into the year, but when we actually sell it, what are we actually receiving for those bushels? So what were the actual bushels we sold? Or in the case of hay, what were the actual tons of hay that we had? And in some cases, you've got a case of you kind of know how many or how much weight the bale is. You kind of plan for your weight on the bale. And so you kind of track how many bales that you have produced, and you equate those bales times the weight back to tons, because when we think about forage crops, a lot of cases we're selling it by the ton. And so we keep track of how many bales times the weight they are. If you've got a scale on the farm where you can kind of check every so often, make sure you're getting the actual pounds you think you are in that bale. Not saying you have to do every one, but occasionally check. I know some farms that do that because they want to kind of have an idea of what they've got for inventory. And then think about if you're selling some of it. Now, if you're a livestock operation, you're probably going to use most of it, but there are still cases where you sell it. So you want to keep track of what the price was you received, because this works two ways. So if you're selling it as the crop, you're looking at the idea of being able to track your income and think about what you've received for revenue. But if you're feeding it, you kind of want to know what that cost was based on market values for the feed. Now, when we look at this is all talking about how we use our own information to really get into and think about comparing ourselves against our own farm's history. Now, the other thing we talked about was looking into the idea of our cost of production compared to industry benchmarking. And so the one thing you want to kind of think about is, well, the number one question that comes up rather is, how do I do that? Where do I go for that information? And so what we want to showcase to everybody, and I'll actually put this in the link. Oh, Ricardo beat me to it.
Yeah, already there.
So Finbin is a database that we use, that we actually participate with farms or with other universities on through Michigan State. There's about 12 universities that supply information to this database. And what happens is, so the first 3 months of every calendar year, my colleagues and I spend time working with farms to actually do this analysis where we take those cash transactions, those tax returns, and use that information, use those farm records to figure out that production year analysis. And then what we do is we break down if the records are good enough, we can break down to that cost of production. And then we actually supply those participating farms that give us permission to do so. We supply this information to Finbin. And this is a public accessible benchmarking database where people can actually go and look at other farms within their own state, if the state's participating, or multiple states. For example, if we want to look at the Midwest, we can do that. And so what I want to showcase to everybody is how we actually pull a report that, say, we want to look at to be able to start comparing our own farm's information. And the first thing we want to do is we're going to look at, we're going to pick on a crop here. And the first one that comes up is corn. Ricardo knows I'm a little biased towards corn. I'm a big fan of growing corn. So we'll stick with corn tonight, but you can actually look at and choose from a variety of crops in here. I know Ricardo's really a big fan of wheat. We could look at wheat if we wanted to. But I'm the one controlling things here, so I'm gonna keep us on corn.
John, I do know you have the power. Just one thing, though, I just want to make sure the link is in the chat. So if you want to follow John and do with him, it might be your chance, because in my case, I just learned when I do. So maybe you want to do, if you can follow along with John.
Yep, and this recording will be available after tonight. So if you kind of want to come back to it and kind of watch through some of these steps, more than happy to make sure that's available to you folks. And then you can always reach out to any of us and we can kind of walk you through it as well. But we talked about, we want to look at different states, and we're looking at Michigan. So we're gonna look at Michigan specifically. And then there's some options here where we can actually kind of look at some years where this has just been updated, so there is some 2020 data that's coming in. Michigan has not provided theirs yet, so this 2020 option this year is actually only available if you look at Minnesota right now. They're the first ones in for this year. So we're going to change this to look at 2019, where we can get to some Michigan data. And you can choose kind of some different options in here. We could actually look at different options if you were a farm that's cash renting, or you want to look at farms that maybe they owned the ground instead of renting, or you could look at both. For tonight's purposes, we'll look at just cash rent to kind of keep things pretty simple. And then if there's detail enough, you can actually look here at different type of practices, tillage systems, row width, chemical resistance factors, if this information is tracked and there's enough to report. Now, there's got to be at least a minimum of 10 farms of similar size for this to be able to pull a report. And so we look at this. So I think we've got everything set. I want Michigan. We're just going to look at the year for right now. We can choose different options in the column headings to look at. And so you can look at things from in terms of profitability, the highs and the lows of profitability. You could look at things at different cropping sizes. But for right now, we'll look at years. And so we will look to generate this report here. And it takes it a little bit of a moment. And we'll actually get this thing up to where people can see it. So the first thing when you're looking at any kind of database is you need to think about the sample size and think about where that data is coming from. There's a lot of different estimates on cost of production, what people think things are going to look like for this next year. But are they based on actual farms? Are they somebody's just kind of intuition because they're pretty knowledgeable about farming and they think they've got a really good idea of where costs and income is going to be? Or are we looking back at actual numbers for farms? And so we look at this. So this is Michigan. And when you pull this report, I'm going to scroll down to the second page. It will actually tell you what states you're looking at and kind of how you've got the report set. And so you can print out multiple of these and look at different things. But the first thing I want to point out to is the actual number of farms in the sample set. Now we've got about 29 farms here, which there's a lot more than 29 farms in Michigan. But this is the number of farms that had the kind of records last year that we could actually break down to this production or cost of production, what we call enterprise analysis is another term for that, to be able to look at this. So, we think about this 29 farms, we could look just at Michigan, but Ricardo, what other states do we have joining us tonight? I know we got a few others from Michigan. Is there some others we can kind of add to this?
We had Utah. We had Minnesota. We also had Ohio. And we had Illinois and New Jersey, but it looks like it's not there.
New Jersey is not part of this database, but they may have their own database that they do participate in. And so there's a lot of Midwest and kind of Western states in here a little bit. But let's just grab all those. We'll see if we can get a larger data set. And we've got those added states now, so we'll run this thing again, see if our sample size is a little bit larger.
We also got from Wisconsin. Sorry, Tasha. And actually, John, while it's running, I have a few questions from Tasha here that would be great to ask. So the first one, are we going to send out that outline you use via email? Is something that you're willing to share, or
Sure.
You don't share? Okay, Tasha. So we're going to be sending that. I'm going to ask Melissa to send that out tomorrow to those emails, okay? And the other question that Tasha had was, where can you find current market prices? In my case, I look at AgWeb, but do you have a better place to go, John?
Current market prices, I would say, are probably, if you're looking for those, there's a number of different places you can look to. If you're talking about commodity prices for local pricing, a lot of your major grain originators, if you're talking about the Andersons, ADM, a lot of those, they'll have those available somewhere on their website. For futures prices, the thing you want to remember is you kind of want to find what your local market is and use that as part of your planning to compare against this to kind of say, well, what does our market look like compared to, if we're going to plan, how do our prices compare to maybe what we've had in the past? Because the big thing is the basis you pay or that they charge against the futures price is kind of important on a local market. So let's hold that thought for a moment here because we'll come back to that thought actually as we kind of get into this. So we've got a lot more farms in this. So now we've got a sample size of about 1,400 farms. And so we look at this and say, okay, that's great. And we look at what we've got here. We've got 6 different states that are actually here. And so we've got a lot of data we can look at, which is great. And most of them, I can tell you that we've ran this before, most of these are coming from the Midwest. So this is a Midwest example, which is very helpful because we're in the Midwest, so that we want to kind of have reminiscent of our industry if we want to look beyond the state. And so the first thing we think about is, well, where does our farm kind of compare to what we see on the screen? And so we're thinking about, well, the first thing is let's look at yields. If we're talking about the yield here, we just want to think about, well, the average on this budget of about 1,400 farms, and we're looking about 175 bushel. Are we above that? Are we below that? Where does our farm kind of compare? We talked about price. How does our price compare to what we were looking at? And now we're looking at last year's information to start with, because we kind of want to know where our farm's capability was. And as we think about planning, we want to know where we are in comparison to that industry. Are we around this average? Do we think we're better than the average, below the average? And then we want to kind of look at this gross return per acre and say, well, where were we at from there? Were we making about the same money, knowing there's some other things kind of thrown in here with we're capturing crop insurance and some of those things that we kind of want to account for when we're thinking about these numbers. But then we also want to switch gears when we want to kind of look at expenses and say, well, where do we line up in terms of seed cost, fertilizer cost? Maybe we want to look at land rent. Land rent here, we're looking at an average of about $191. Are we about paying that? Are we below that? And then we want to kind of look at the return. We've got return over what are our direct costs, which is our variable costs here. So we're seeing that the average of these farms is making about $132. It's our farm kind of there. Or do we want to kind of look maybe more at what we talked about, cost of production, not just the variable, it's the fixed as well, and this depreciation value. Is our farm doing as well when we account for these things as maybe the average? Now I'm gonna back up because we're looking at the average. We talked about we kind of want to look at to see if we're in the upper echelon of the industry, or how do we compare? And so one of the things you do when you're in the FinBin is you can get to this profitability group, is actually turning that on gives us those ranges to look at. And so we want to do that. We'll get the report to pull up here. And we'll be able to see, we're going to have a couple different columns here where we can kind of see the high, the low, the middle. Now we've got about 1,400 farms this thing's trying to pull through, so it takes it a moment. But let's kind of get this up where we can see it, get our highlighter back out. And so now we want to kind of talk about where does the high and the low, and we'll pick on the middle a little bit. So we've got the low 20%, the high 20%. Again, we're going to start with yields. Well, we've got the low is about 158. The high is about 190. And this 40 to 60% is our median. So we're talking about 177, kind of close to what the average is. We talked earlier about price. Is there any big differences in price that we want to look at between? Not a huge difference in price, a couple pennies here or there. But let's talk about, we'll scroll down here a little bit. Let's talk about gross return per acre. Boy, we're seeing a big difference here. We're at $600 and about $60, 742 for the folks in the middle, and then $830 per acre on gross revenue. So automatically, when you think about your farm and looking at your actual, where are you falling within the gross revenue? And then as you think about where you fall here, you want to think about, well, what's driving these things for these farms? What's driving the numbers for these farms? Because now we want to think about, well, let's come back down and we want to look at this net return per acre. And we know this one is our low 20. They're losing about $139 per acre. The middle's got about $33, almost $34 it's getting to keep. And where the high 20 is looking at about 187. So what's driving that? And we start to look at these expenses a little bit and kind of think, well, yields, we saw a big difference in yields up here. Is fertilizer cost a big change? Well, let's look at fertilizer. $132, 127, 112. There's about a $20 difference between the high and the low, but that's probably not that's not the big driver. $20 in fertilizer is not necessarily going to bring you about 32 bushels in yield, so we won't pick on fertilizer too much. But we look at some of these other expenses where we'll talk about seed. Grab a different color here. We've got about $112 in seed, $106 in the middle, and about $99. Nothing really too major there. We're talking about $10, $12 difference. But suddenly we start to look at how these things add up. Let's look at land rent. $202 versus $193 versus $185. Well, suddenly, Ricardo, do you see any one thing that sticks out to you? Any one major expense here? You're muted.
Well, land rent's quite different, but it's not that far, right?
Right.
But seed cost also is changing quite a lot too. So What do you think? Or is anything outside the one you put together?
Well, the thing that what I want to highlight for people is you're on the right track, Ricardo. What we're seeing here is this difference of it's not any one thing. It's a lot of things that add up as we think about the entirety. Now we're just looking at variable costs. Let's come down and see some differences in terms of we've got interest cost in here. A lot higher interest cost from the middle to the low, a lot different from the higher to the low. But what you start to find is that when you start to see all these differences, that, we're not talking about huge swings in a lot of cases on these expenses, but you notice that the low 20s got a lot more expense overall on many items
Right.
that, and they've got some yield issue going on that maybe that was an issue from the year, just that year. So the question you start to ask is, well, $10 doesn't seem like a lot on seed. $20 doesn't seem a lot on fertilizer. We talked about that earlier. Land rent, there's some big differences between, we're talking about $25, $27 between the high. What are the little things that we can do and make the changes in the operation and how we're spending things to kind of get us closer to being on this side? Maybe there's not a whole lot we're going to do about yield. Maybe this was a poor year. We're going to be up a little bit better. Maybe we're kind of in the middle. But what can we do from an expense standpoint to get ourselves closer to where the upper level is? Is it buying things a little bit sooner? Is it taking advantage of discounts, not waiting till later on if we've got the operating or we've got the working capital? Understanding when we've got a good price because we've done our cost of production, we know what we historically have been at. We're building our budgets. Can we actually utilize that information? And the idea is you compare and see, well, how does our farm, where do we fit in here? That if we're over here on the left and we're in this low 20, how do we start to work our way over to the high 20 and start working our way to that top kind of range for the industry there?
John, so just kind of going back to make sure I understood, like you start talking about like the details matter, and it sounds like you're finalizing with that idea as well, because you mentioned, hey, it's not just about the big things, but what can I do in small things? Is that so? Is that the message you are trying to send?
Yep, that is the main message. In fact, one of the things that I want to highlight for people is we talked about tools that people can use, and this FinBin is a tool. Another tool I want to highlight, and I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here, and we're kind of getting close to wrapping up here. I want to highlight for people that we have some budgeting tools that try to combine this FinBin database with the actual developing of a budget. So on our farm management page through MSU Extension, when you go to this page, and Ricardo, if you could put the link to
Sure.
this in the chat. When we go to our budget and cost of production page, we have a number of budgeting tools. We have some for grain. We've got some for forages. We've got an enterprise budget for cow calf that people can use. Now the cow calf, I don't believe has any FinBin data, but this crop budget estimating tool when we're looking at the grain one here, it does have some FinBin data. And I'm actually going to pull up. I've already downloaded one to save some time. And I'm going to kind of put this a little bigger on the screen so people can see it easier. But what we've done is we've actually provided a FinBin example to go alongside where you can input your own information. And you can kind of compare to some industry data. And this is Michigan data. I think currently we've got 2018. We need to put 19 in, I believe. But you get at least an idea of what the industry is looking at. And you can input your own numbers and kind of see where historically have we kind of fallen, or where are we falling in comparison to the industry, and knowing what your own cost of production has been for the farm, you can kind of say, are we above the industry, below the industry, kind of right on line with it? How are those numbers going to change? And we look at both variable and fixed costs. And you can even put in some financing information in this tool, and I'll zoom this out a little bit so it's a little easier to see all the categories here. But the idea is you can use that information and actually input your numbers to this budget to kind of give yourself a comparison. And we also have some help in terms of fertilizer costs is sometimes a little bit problematic for folks. So we actually have a fertilizer calculator that people can use to try to figure out what the cost is of the fertilizer they've bought and break that down to a cost per acre. If you're trying to extract your nitrogen from a phosphate fertilizer like an 18460 or nitrogen from a sulfur product like ammonium sulfate 210024 sulfur, we've got some tools in this to kind of help people along with that too. But the idea is once you get some numbers in here, you can kind of break this down and say, well, where do we compare and what changes do we need to kind of think about looking at in comparison to that industry to kind of get us to where we want? And we go back to this budget here, and we want to be able to kind of keep in mind, where do we typically find ourselves, or where have we looked at this previous year, or we can look at multiple years. And we go back to our budgeting to say, as I switch back over to the Excel file, what is our plan for next year going to look like, and how does that really compare to kind of thinking about the overall. And so we're going to switch back here to one other tool that I want to mention to people that's actually available on the same website. If we go back to, I want to highlight is that maybe you don't know what the number should be for your farm. You're kind of starting out. You're not quite sure what the number should be. This document's a little dated. It's 2019. There is an effort underway to kind of get more updated information. But this 2019 custom machine and work rate estimates are very helpful if we're thinking about certain activities on the farm. If you don't know what it's going to cost you in terms of, if you're going to have to hire out some work, or you're trying to get an idea of what should the fuel cost be if I'm trying to figure out a fuel number for activities on the farm. You're trying to think about, what a machine cost per hour might be. Maybe thinking about, well, if I was, does that help me kind of figure out maybe an estimate on what are some regular wear and tear type repairs and maintenance I might think about? This is another useful tool to kind of help you figure out numbers if you're not sure how to get to those. So Ricardo, I'm going to switch this back over to the PowerPoint here, and
John, do you mind? So we still have pretty much everyone here in the call. One thing I want to do, just to be respectful, I'm going to just share the survey. You can go out and fill out the survey if you are looking for CCA or RUP credits if you're in Michigan. But also, if you want to help us to do a better job as well, please go and fill out the survey. I'm going to put the link in the chat box. And if you want to stay, more than welcome to stay. We're going to go a little bit over here. But for those folks that need to leave at 8, feel free to fill out the survey, and you get your RUP and CCAs, and also to help us do a better job.
Yep.
Yeah, John.
Thanks, Ricardo. That's good. So kind of as we kind of think about wrapping up here, there's just a couple more slides that I kind of want to go through for everybody. We've kind of talked about this idea of using budgets and comparisons to make decisions. And so we've talked a little bit about, are we getting similar yields? Are we getting similar prices? Are we in the low 20%, high 20% in the median? Are we spending more on expenses? Is land rent something that's jumping out to you? It's one of those things that we don't talk about a lot, but at the same time, we do talk a lot about it because it's one of those things that comes up at the coffee shop that, boy, there's a lot of high rent being paid. Well, how high is your rent? Are we spending too much? Look at the industry comparison. That can kind of help you to understand where you maybe fall. Are we not spending enough? If we're talking about yield concerns and we look at where we're at in terms of the industry, if we've got lower yields and we see we're not spending as much on fertilizer, or maybe we're not spending enough on chemicals, we've got some weed resistance issues, or we're just not taking care of the weeds and that's impacting some of the yields we've got. Can we see that coming out in the industry? Or is it maybe a matter of we're spending the same, but the results are very different? We've got similar numbers, but we're not seeing the same results in terms of a yield output. We're not seeing the same thing in terms of revenue. So if we're spending the same, maybe it's more about what we're spending the money on. So maybe we're spending a lot of things on on fertilizer and chemicals, but maybe our chemical program needs to be reevaluated, or maybe our fertility program needs to be evaluated. The same with feed costs on a livestock operation. And so we kind of come back to this idea of paying attention to details as a must. And this is kind of a thought I want people to kind of think about is when you think about your yield history, you think about production success. We focus a lot of our efforts on making sure we've got good yields, good production. If we're raising livestock, good milk quality, good pounds of milk. We want the right amount of pounds and leanness on our hogs, or looking at beef production. And so we track the production side, but we should be thinking the same thing about our cost of production, because that's our financial success. They really go hand in hand. I mean, some of the reason we track production details is we want to understand the farm's abilities when it comes to what can we produce. What is the farm really going to be able to provide in terms of yield or overall production? What are the areas of concern we have? We've talked a little bit about some examples that maybe we need to think about from an agronomy standpoint or a nutrition standpoint, because what we want to do is we want to make plans to address those concerns and improve the overall farm performance. Well, those same things apply when you think about the details in your farm records and actually making those little notes and trying to track some of this information, because you want to be able to know what the farm is able to achieve from a financial standpoint. You want those details so you can accurately compare yourself to the industry and get an idea of identifying where those areas of concern maybe are for your farm that maybe you can't see just looking back at your own history. And really, as we think about a farm budget, it's your plan to improve farm performance. If you're happy where the farm is at, that's great. But really, there's always an opportunity to improve and to get better. And a lot of cases, a lot of the details and the hints that we need to figure out some of our production practices are kind of hidden in some of those numbers. So if you're tracking those details, some of that stuff starts to come out. And as I mentioned before, it kind of comes back to this idea of you can't see where you're going if you don't know where you've been. That's very true when it comes to production history. It's very true also when we think about cost of production and the farm's financial success, because ultimately we can raise all the bushels we want. But if we don't have financial success, our business is not going to stay in business. And so we want to track those details and get a better idea of where our farm operation's at. Go ahead, Ricardo.
And John, you correct me here, man, but I do think the message that you're trying to say, and you tell me, garbage in, garbage out. I mean, if you're not getting the details, even without that nice Excel file that you show that I can put all the information, but if I'm not getting good information from my own operation, the numbers are not going to match, and they, instead of helping me, they might actually make things go worse. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, because what you're going to find is you're going to have a kind of a false sense of security in some cases about what your operation is capable of, or maybe in some cases you're going to be kind of oblivious to maybe what the problems are. And we've had these rough years here the last 6-7 years where we've had some financial struggles on a lot of farms. We've seen some really good prices right now in our commodity markets, but what were some of the things that we could take away from the last couple years that maybe could have made things a little better, because we started looking at those details. We started to iron out some things that maybe would have made the situation a little better for us. And at the same time, we make those changes and we've got really good prices. So if we make improvements and we kind of iron out where these areas of concern are, we get to keep more of those dollars we're generating on these higher prices. And so I always come back to, it's not what you make, it's what you keep on the operation. And now getting to that point, getting to that information to be able to help you make those decisions, to do this is a little bit tougher for a lot of folks, because we're talking about trying to keep details. You got a lot of things going on the farm. You're trying to keep track of records, and doing some of this work's a little problematic. Maybe you think it's going to take you, it's more than you can handle by yourself. And so the thing I want to point out is that MSU Extension actually has a program available for folks that can help with this. It's called the MSU Farm program, and it's an educational service that is actually designed to assist farms with financial records and this decision making we're talking about. My colleagues and I on the farm business team work with farm clients to kind of look through these records. We've got a good support system on campus. And we actually, this 3-month period I talked about at the beginning, where we've been doing these farm financial analysis, we work with a lot of farm folks that do this, and we convert those tax records or those cash transaction records from your accounting into that production level view. And so as we think about that, it's something that often we need some help kind of making some double checks on that, thinking through some of the software we're using, or just in terms of how you keep your records. Maybe you're keeping them by hand, but maybe an extra set of eyes kind of helps to kind of keep things on track and help you kind of weigh through some of that. So don't feel like you have to do this by yourself. MSU has the service. There are other services out there as well. I don't want to completely kind of take the thunder away from other folks, but MSU has the service. It's been around for a number of years. Very helpful service that can kind of work with you to get these records kind of go in that direction and get you to this point that you want to be. So Ricardo, that's my last slide. So I think what we'll do is I'll stop sharing here, and we'll kind of go to the Q&A here and kind of see what some of these questions we've got are.
Right. Yeah, we have 3 questions that were not answered. Folks, I appreciate you guys so much staying longer. I know that we went a little bit off, but it's good information. So thank you so much for sticking around. John, do you have the questions? Do you want me to read out loud, or can do it yourself?
You go ahead and read them out loud. I've got them up. I can see them. Go ahead and read them.
Okay. All right. So the first question is from Cornelius. He asked, as a beginner farmer, what's the best way to start averaging costs per acre? And does that method work for all vegetables? Very good question.
Yep, that is a very good question. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, that these concepts do work for all types of crops. And so if you're raising vegetables, that you want to kind of apply the same thing. To start with an average cost per acre. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you when it comes to fruit and vegetables. One of the things we struggle with, especially in Michigan, now we're a very diverse state. We do not have a lot of fruit and vegetable farms that participate in the financial analysis. That is something that we have continually worked on to try to figure out how we get more people to participate. And so we don't have as much as good information as we'd like to have for Michigan. But the first thing would be to look at some of those databases and kind of see what are some industry numbers that are available. What are some of the budgets you can find? Because there's a lot of number of states that will publish kind of an estimated budget that kind of do the same process we've talked about tonight, where they look at the data from the industry and they develop kind of a plan based on looking at historic numbers and account for any changes for the year. And so looking for these, what a lot of people call them enterprise budgets that are out there from universities would be a first place to start. The other would be to look at the industry data, finding some databases that actually have that. That's one of those things we could look at Finbin and kind of see what's available to give you at least an idea of some rudimentary costs to get you started.
Awesome. John, we have another question from Marty here. He was asking, are the yield blended, irrigated and non-irrigated, or are they separated?
That's a very good question. When producers actually do the production areas or the enterprising, what we actually try to make sure people do is separate those out and be able to track those separately. Now, you might have some costs that kind of overlap a little bit. And so we can kind of work with allocating those to make sure those stay, if you're talking about fuel costs that are kind of the same, seed costs may be the same, but when you're thinking about the actual differences, we want to try to track those, because you're going to have maybe differences in fertilizer that you're using for irrigated. You may have some differences in seed. So a lot of cases, what you're finding there is they are separated out in a lot of cases, and you can actually tell the Finbin to separate that information out if you're looking on the database too.
John, I have 2 more questions, but I wanted to ask you a question. Are there any apps out there to help me to track expenses as a farmer? Is there anything that can help me with receipts and everything else?
I want to say there is. I'm drawing a blank at the moment on what some of those might be. there's a number of different apps that for rudimentary accounting and tracking of receipts and expenses for every daily life I know are out there. There probably are some farm versions, none that I'm actually familiar with at the moment, but in this day and age, I wouldn't be surprised.
So I do think that Florence is saying that Wave, Mint, they are all apps that we can use, all right?
What's that?
Florence said in the chat that Mint, Wave, Tosh, they are all apps that they can be used for accounting.
Yes. Yep, there's a couple good ones there.
Yeah, and so can I use even QuickBooks to help me with some stuff?
Well, QuickBooks is actually an accounting software, and it's a kind of a new software to the Telfarm service. Actually, a lot of farmers use QuickBooks, and it's one of the things that if you're looking for accounting support on QuickBooks for the farm, because QuickBooks wasn't initially designed to be used by farms, but one of the things that the Telfarm program is working with, and some colleagues of mine are working with Telfarm to kind of make sure that we kind of have a system set up to help producers with that. We're kind of piloting some stuff this year, but looking forward to when we kind of get through this year and into 2022, where we'll have a pretty good system in place that we can use to give some pretty good support for QuickBooks. I don't know it's so much an app though, Ricardo. That's more of an accounting software.
Okay. Yeah. I think I used the wrong term here, but is everything app nowadays, right? Yeah. But yeah. So thank you, Florencia, for helping us with some
thank you very
of those
much. Apps.
So I do have a very tricky question from Ray here, and I want you to be ready. Okay, just sit down and relax, I suppose. If I'm using my daily driver for hauling a livestock and other things, how can I track the cost of hauling without going through the complexity of tracking the cost of operating the truck and how much is farm use and how much is personal use, man? Be careful. If you say too much, RIS is gonna come here after you. So
well, what a lot of cases actually what the IRS will actually recommend in this case is that if you've got an overall idea of the total cost for what the hauling is, so you got any idea of total fuel expenses, repairs, those type of things, what the IRS actually recommends is trying to split that out on maybe a percentage basis to figure out how much was farm use, how much was personal, to get you kind of close. We get to some of these expenses. We talked earlier about there are some things that are very difficult to track. And in some cases, the time to track the details is more than it's worth. And so in a case like that, where it's really difficult to track down the details, or it's really going to take you a lot of extra effort for not a lot of extra gain, what you kind of think about is you have to go back to what is reasonable for the farm. What's the kind of percentage breakdown that actually went to the farm and what was maybe more personal, and kind of break that out as your guidepost, and thinking about what you've actually used that equipment for, and kind of come up with a reason, good justification that you can kind of come back to and say, we made so many trips, or we looked at and said overall most of the use was for the farm, or vice versa, most was for the personal. You kind of come up with a reasonable percentage and kind of allocate the expenses that way.
Awesome. We have another question from Greg here. What tools do you have for filling out loan applications? Do you have any tools that can help those folks?
When it comes to preparing for loan applications, that's one of the things that when we sit down and work with people on the farm financial analysis that actually does this production year viewpoint, what we use is a software called FinPack. And you can develop your balance sheet in there. It's actually got the software to do the analysis. And what we actually work with folks on doing is you can create that balance sheet because you're going to need it for the analysis anyway. But you also have the breakdown of what your previous year was in that farm analysis to get you to that cost of production. Within that software, and it's a software producers can buy. I recommend producers buy it and learn it if they want to get to this level of detail, because you can create projections within that software. It's a wonderful program that allows you to really make good use out of your farm records and use that detail that you spent so much time tracking and been very diligent about tracking during the year that you can create that information. There are actually some links within FinPack to helping you kind of develop some of the, if you're talking about USDA loans, for example, there is some examples in there where you can actually get a copy of their form and and you use the stuff within the FinPack software to do that. Another way to do that is you can actually do this by hand. On our farm management page, we actually do have where people can do this farm analysis by hand. It's on a Word document where if you want to do it by paper and pencil, you can do that as well. We also have some balance sheet and income statement information that's on our website as well. And we're talking about multiple from multiple universities, some from USDA are listed as well, and going from there. And sorry if I'm not pronouncing enough. I see the question come up. FinPack is the program I'm talking about that does the analysis.
All right. So I don't think we answer Marty's question. So we need to make sure that we answer. The question was if that thing being report, they can go set. You can go and get information from irrigated fields and none. Are we able to do that?
Yes, you can. You can look at it specifically if you just want to look at irrigated. Just look at non-irrigated. The question, the thing you have to make sure is, was there enough farms? They have to have a minimum of 10 farms of similar size to be able to generate that. So you might need to go and look at multiple states if you don't have enough.
All right. So we do have a few more questions. Oh, and I love all those questions coming here. So yeah. The next one is from Orlando. Do you all have information on budgeting or funding for transitional military members? I know there are programs that specifically help veterans to start farms, and was looking at what might help when creating my budget and business planning. I understand that the budgeting for crops, livestock is more towards what initial start costs and other options. Can I plan to use or apply to use to help to start the farm? Thanks in advance.
Okay. So one of the things that we try to work with people when it comes to for our transitioning military folks is we do have veteran services through MSU Extension. I actually one of the folks that works in there is a good friend of mine that he and I actually talk about this kind of stuff a lot, where we try to make sure that the resources we've got are available to those folks. If you're talking about a startup operation, that's where we kind of get back to trying to figure out where we find the numbers, and we'll spend some time working with that area of extension, talking about how do we help people kind of get an idea if we don't know where to start for a number, what should be a reasonable number. A lot of cases we start to talk about building a network with people where you're looking at not only looking at what some industry numbers are, but if depending what it is you want to get into for an operation, what are some of those startup costs? If you're looking from what scale you're looking at, do you need to purchase equipment? Is it buildings? Start to think about some of that, those initial startup costs. And we actually kind of do that as part of what a lot of people like to call business planning. But it's the steps of developing a written business plan that really you think through, what is the farm operation going to need to be successful? How's it going to operate? And we eventually work our way back to the finances, but we think about the overall business structure and the roles of people within that, and really start to iron out what are we going to need to be successful moving forward. So there is help for that. It's a combination of folks like myself on the farm business team. I know Florencia is here joining us tonight. It's another colleague of mine that we help people with that, but then we also work with, we've got programs through the veteran office on campus that does some work with that as well. And so you may see a couple of faces when you're trying to do that, or it may be where you kind of bounce back between us, depending on what phase you're at in your startup operation.
All right, so John, we have one last question. This question is very, very good to end our webinar tonight. And how often throughout the year do you recommend revisiting and adjusting budgets and financial? Do you want to become that crazy guy changing every month, or you want to do just once a year?
Well, I think at a minimum, you want to do it once a year. What I honestly recommend for people is don't make a budget and then forget about it. What you want to start out with, I actually recommend there's at least 3 times a year you need to be thinking about that budget. The first time you make it, which is typically, if we're talking about crop production here, we're talking about typically from winter to spring, we're looking at the budget and we're kind of figuring out our plan for the year. The next time is to kind of stop in the middle of the season and kind of get an idea of how are things going. Are we kind of in line with our plan? Are we seeing some major changes? I'm going to go back to 2019. 2019 is a great example for a lot of these cases. 2019 didn't turn out like anything we had planned. And in the middle of the year was a good time to say, okay, we're not going to have all these acres planted that we were thinking of.
I might need to change, right?
Yeah, we might need to rethink how this is going to work. And this is something that I did with a couple producers where we came back to the plan and said, what is the step forward going to be? What is our situation now? What is our adjusted plan going to look like? Maybe it's a good year. Maybe we get to the middle of the year, you look at things, hey, everything's on target, but you've at least kind of looked to see, are we still on track to get to where we need to be? And then the third time of the year is at the end of the year. Once you've completed your harvest, once you've kind of get everything in the bin or everything's in the feed bunker, as you start to collect your information and we start to think about taxes and filing taxes about the end of the year. But we start to want to kind of rethink our numbers and say, okay, how did our plan we started at the beginning of the year, we got through the summer, things maybe look good or we made some adjustments. How did the rest of the year go? Did we have some other major changes that we got to harvest and things didn't go well? Or maybe the price bottomed out. We don't have production issues. We've got a market issue. Where were some changes at to say, do we need to rethink some of the decisions that we're making? Because this actually kind of ties back into your tax planning of how did the year end up? And what are some changes we've got to make to not only work through our tax situation, but to work through our profitability situation, our ability to kind of keep the operation moving forward. And so that's a good time to kind of look back at the budget. Now, I would also say, once you've done the analysis, which most people do the analysis of a production year, typically in the spring of the year after. So we just completed that with a lot of folks. That would probably be the fourth time I would go back and look just to kind of have an idea of how did I plan the first time around? And do I want to make some changes to how I do planning moving forward?
With that, folks, I very much appreciate you guys coming today, staying that long. We know that we passed like almost 30 minutes past our time. So thank you very much for joining us today. And feel free to contact me or John or any of us if you have any questions related to this topic. We are here for you guys. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate that. And guys, have a great night, okay?